Hello, everyone. My name is Ross Sandell, and I'm the director of the USF School of Aging Studies. I'm excited to welcome you to another installment of the Distinguished Lecture Series. The Distinguished Lecture Series is organized and supported by the School of Aging Studies and the Florida Policy Exchange Center on Aging. The goal of the series is to bring top scholars and other distinguished guests to the School of Aging Studies, whether in person or as we do today through a video conference, to enrich and educate our students, our partners, our community, and our colleagues. Today, it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Karen Fingerman join us as our distinguished lecturer. Now, let me give the stage to Dr. Bill Haley, professor in the School of Aging Studies, to introduce today's guest.
Thanks, folks. I am really excited about introducing Karen Fingerman. I've gotten to know her very well through our work this year on the APA Committee on Aging. I had known of her scholarship for years, and it's just a thrill to include her today. Karen has been a rock star and a superstar in the field of aging for a long time. She graduated Harvard University in 1987, and I learned by reviewing her CV that she actually was an undergraduate commencement speaker, so she was already shining out at that early time in her life. She got her PhD at the University of Michigan in psychology, went on to a postdoc at Stanford School of Medicine, and then faculty jobs in human development and family studies at Penn State, at Purdue, and she's been at UT Austin since 2011, where she's now director of the Texas Aging and Longevity Center. Karen has had a tremendous career. She's received early career awards, both the APA Division 20 Springer Award and the GSA Baltus Award. And I don't know of anybody else who's won both of those early career awards. She's a fellow of APA, APS, and the GSA. She's on 7 different editorial boards. And among her amazing accomplishments is that she's also sort of a media star, most recently featured in Rolling Stone magazine in an interview about ageism. So Karen's got the ability to do great scholarship, but also to communicate with the public. Her research is in the general area of the social and emotional processes throughout adulthood and health and well-being, but I know her particularly for her work in intergenerational family relationships, and she's got a really unique study of multiple generations of family members and how they provide help across generations and what the costs and benefits of those are. So before Karen gets started, let me set out a few ground rules for today. So I urge everybody, turn on the live Q&A. You'll have an opportunity there. Karen wants to be participatory, and she's going to be asking some questions and wanting you to respond. And so please type in your answers when she does that. I will be moderating the Q&A. I ask that you not ask any questions of Karen during the presentation. That's really vital for you to understand what's going on, but I will moderate it and decide whether any questions come up. And at the end of the talk, there'll be plenty of chance for asking Karen questions or making comments. Again, I will moderate those and read them out loud. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen, and Karen, we're really looking forward to hearing you here.
Well, thank you. That was really very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be talking today about some non-family relationships, weaker ties in late life, an area that my research team has recently become interested in. And I'll just give you one example. You know, I know 2020 has been, almost has become a swear word, but I do have to say that one really fabulous thing that happened for me was that
we don't have the slides up quite yet, but we'll have them up.
Okay, it's all right. Well, I'll just talk the title of the talk is Getting Out of the Family, Weaker Ties in Late Life. And so one of the great things that happened for me in 2020 was that I got to meet Bill Haley by joining CONA, and I'm sure you all appreciate what an amazing colleague he is and what an amazing leader. And I feel very grateful. I'm very grateful that I get to be here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these weaker ties. I'm going to go ahead and start without a slide because I don't think you need my first slide. what I talk about to start with is that older adults who have stronger ties, who have relationships that they report feeling connected to, live longer. I'm going to show you that when we have the slides up. They live in better health and they live in better psychological well-being. They're really, relationships have a very strong effect on well-being. And one of the things that was very interesting is my colleague here at UT, Deb Umbersom, was part of a paper in 1987 that showed that the effect size for social integration on mortality was the same size as the effect size for smoking and cancer. So that really got people started wondering what accounts for that. How on earth can this amorphous thing, a relationship, predict who's alive in 5 years? Now, the kinds of measure that that Umbersom's paper, it was House and Umbersom used, was very sociological and it was very structural. So it was sort of a, are you married? Do you have grown kids that you see every 2 weeks or talk to every 2 weeks? Are you engaged in different kinds of formal clubs like the Rotary Club? Do you do informal things like meet your friends for coffee every 2 weeks? And so it wasn't even that broad a spectrum. It's like 5 questions they ask and it predicts mortality. Now, what's interesting about that for us as researchers is we might say, well, that's not sufficient. But the fact that you can detect something with rough measures means it's a really robust finding. And so from there, we've had about 25 years, 30 years of intense research trying to explain this phenomenon. It's very perplexing. It's kind of what got me into the field. One of the things to think about, it looks like the slides are up. Is that right? Assuming the slides are up, I'm
yes,
now
the slides
on.
Are up.
Okay, so let's go to slide 3, if that's okay. And I'll just very quickly point out, and you can pop up the red box there if it's not showing up, that would be an animation. What you can see in this slide is that this was a meta-analysis on mortality. There you go, that red box. This is a meta-analysis on mortality. Now, I didn't put the whole thing up here because I want to make a point about the different kinds of relationships, but you can see that the relationships predict mortality better than smoking, better than all kinds of things that I could show you in here that are behavioral. There's 2 of the 2 longest bars here. The first one is high and low social support contrasted. So that's really about close ties. But the second one at the bottom there is the complex measure of social integration. It's what I've just been talking about. And it's the idea that you have close ties. You're married, you saw or spoke to your kids, but you also have weak ties. And I'm going to define that for you in just a minute. Let's go to the next slide. This is, you always have to put up a model if you're going to, give a talk in the social sciences. Well, I didn't have nearly as good a model as Lisa Berkman, who was one of the first people to make this discovery. I'm not going to make you try to figure out this model. I'm just going to tell you that, first of all, she has a way better model than I could ever develop. And second of all, the key thing here to know is that she's looking at that social integration. She's going beyond just the close ties. Let's flip to the next slide. The idea here is the mechanisms of what's explaining this mortality thing. There's definitely the close ties that matter. So that's your attachment, your affection, your support. This is an area where most of us have done the field has been there in late life. I've looked at this extensively. I've looked at affection, I've looked at conflict, I've looked at support. My collaborators have too. Where we've moved recently is this social integration, because that is the component. And let's go to the next slide. Let me just say close ties matter because they enhance well-being. They enhance your emotional well-being. And I'm just briefly giving a sort of recognition to Laura Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity theory. It's been a very dominant theory in the field. My gosh, there have been hundreds of studies. And what they show is that for shortened time perspective, when you feel like you don't have much time left, you reduce your peripheral and weak ties and your positive emotions increase. So if you click, I think you'll get, I think there's an animation there that'll give you the next point. If you click to move there you go. Close partners bring you the emotional rewards. And that's what happens when you grow older or when something happens like they showed it with the transfer of Hong Kong. in 1997 that people felt like they had less time left and everybody wanted close partners and emotional rewards. But, and this theory has hundreds and hundreds of studies, but let's go to the next slide. The next slide talks about network diversity, and there is a literature on this which also looks at emotional rewards, all of those things, better health, feeling happier. And this network diversity research shows that it's the mix. It's the mix with neighbors and group activities. So if we go to the next slide, this was a study that was done by Howard Litwin. There's Claire Wagner did one of the first ones. Kate Fiore has a lovely line of work looking at network types. And basically what they do is they look at all the different relationships that people have and they grouped them together in old age. And what you see here is sort of the percentages of how the older population distributes. And it's pretty close to this across all the studies. And a diverse network is that well socially integrated network that I talked about. A friend network would be one where you have friends, but you're not spending all that much time in the clubs and neighbors and all that. Neighbor is primarily, actually, this could be someone who lives alone, doesn't have kids, and they're connected to their neighbors. And the restricted is that socially isolated person who has very limited social contact. If we go to the next slide, that's your mortality statistics. So your restricted network, 5 years later, 43% of them had died. The community clan is a very restricted group that only sort of sticks with their immediate, sort of people that they view as them. It's sort of an in-group, out-group family. You can see that. And the diverse and the friend networks are where the longevity is occurring for them right now. We go to the next slide. This begs the question of what is the role of these weak ties? Why do they matter? Carstenson's theory has shown that people try to trim them. And yet these network theories are showing, wait a minute, there's some huge benefit from including these people somehow in your life. Next slide. This was why I call it weak ties. Mark Granovetter in the 1970s published this paper called The Strength of Weak Ties. And it was a really interesting paper on finding a job. And that was what he was looking at. So this is not typically a much the kinds of groups that we might be most interested in, who might be more likely to be retired or not to be in a work world where they have a lot of career connections. And what this showed, so at that time, everybody thought it was nepotism, right? Well, certainly nepotism has had some resurgence recently, but at that time, what it turned out was that it wasn't your family. It was your weak ties. It was the people you didn't know well who could connect you to the resources to get a job. And that's because the people you know a lot of the same people you know. So if there's a job amongst the people you know, chances are you kind of know about it. But that person who you only see every now and then might know about something you haven't heard about. And if you go to the next slide, the term that I ended up coining some time ago, and this, Bill said I kind of like to be out there in the popular media, and this was, I don't know if I would encourage people to do this, but I let a journalist convince me to help write a pop psych book, and it was on consequential strangers. And that's the idea that the people you meet, it was much broader than weak ties, because it could just be your barista, or actually I live really close to a grocery store, and so I used to just go there all the time before COVID, and now I just am very careful and I don't go very often. But I went just the other day, and I know all the checkout people, and I know the people at Starbucks and whatever there. And it turned out that one of my neighbors, who I almost never see, was also in the checkout line. And I just felt like I was like in a sitcom, because I was like, "Oh, hi, Judy," to the checkout lady, and I was like, "Hi, how's your grandchild, Leslie?" It felt like it was important to me. I don't really know these people very well. I know one of them has a grandchild, just barely anything. And you might not think of them as even weak ties. They're almost strangers, but they matter to me, and it made my day that I actually saw them again. So let's go to the next slide. And here, I thought we'd do this in the Q&A. Just thinking about it, let's think pre-COVID for a minute. Who are your weak ties pre-COVID? Writing it in there, or your consequential strangers. Let's go ahead and give that a try. Well, okay, I'm not sure if that's.
Folks, let me encourage everybody to type some responses there in the Q&A if you can.
Well, it's all right, because if you flip through, I'll show you guys a list if you want to. It's animated, so if you want to go ahead and click as though you were going to the next slide, you'll get colleagues that you might not collaborate with frequently. People at the grocery store, these are all of them. People at the gym, exactly. These are exactly the things that we're thinking of. Exactly. So if you click again for the animation, you'll get that list. So yeah, these are the ones that I thought of. The coworkers, the neighbors, your service provider or recipient of service you provide, the people, some of your mentors and your mentees are going to be friends, but some of them aren't. Some of them will be a little bit more distant, and yet they still matter. The person who just gave you that one bit of advice. I had a dean at my first job, which also was USF, University of San Francisco. And he said to me, he said at orientation, I don't remember this guy's name, I never really saw him again, but at orientation for us, he said, you don't teach the people you once were. You don't teach the students you want to have. You take the people in front of you and you move them forward. That's teaching. And that was like so profound for me. He was a mentor, he was a consequential stranger, he influenced my whole life. And yet, you know, it was a passing, fleeting thing, though it was a little more than that, because for that whole year I would see him while I taught there. Community groups, some of your connections via close ties. So this is really interesting that like I have friends who would have us over for a holiday every year, and they have a friend that I don't see anywhere else except that once a year, and I really like seeing that person. So there's a lot of different ways. I have some really distant relatives who are second, third cousins. I just heard from one, she's in her 80s because she had time during the pandemic shutdown. And those people matter. In some way we feel connected. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about why that would be. Okay, so there's a theory, a functionalist theory. It's been around a really long time. And what it suggests is that ties serve different functions. And it was a really neat study that first did this. And it was a study way long ago that looked at people who were widowed, who belonged to like a widowed group. These are parents. It was parents raising children who were widowed. I mean, this is like the 1960s, early 70s. And they realized that the widow group couldn't like fully fulfill them because they were missing the attachment, the support, the actual partner. And then they looked at spouses who moved to like this community, like some new company went in and they were all living in this residential community. But and this is so long ago that it was like the men all worked and the women didn't who moved in here. And they had really good spousal ties, but the women weren't meeting anyone. And so that was missing. And so the argument is that different kinds of relationships serve different functions. Now that's really out of date, but it looks like it's relevant right now. So close ties give you attachment. They make you feel like you belong. The weaker ties give you that social capital. That's that Mark Granovetter that you can get those jobs. But when you're in late life, that might not be as important to you as stimulation and novelty. It also brings that familiarity in outside settings. So the reason you like to see the people at the store or the people at the gym, in part, is that you're going to this place and there are people there who kind of ground you. The other thing is a connection to your personal past or a pattern to your daily life that, oh yeah, on Thursdays I always see so-and-so. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, I want to tell you about my first study of weak ties. And I say it's an oldie but a goodie because I did this study in the 1990s. It's my holiday card study. And back, so those of you who are younger than me, you might not know this, but back in the olden days, we sent holiday cards and we wrote personal messages in them. We didn't like have some printers at home or whatever. We wrote to each person. And then we walked uphill through the snow. We had to put stamps on them and we mailed them in the box. And just to put this all into perspective, my son's away at college and we were walking him through doing his mail-in ballot. And we said, okay, he's showing us on the camera, whatever. And we said, okay, now you have to go mail it. And there's this pause and he goes, you mean like one of those blue boxes we have in Austin? And I was like, oh my God, he's never mailed a letter. So I was like, yeah, those could be recycling bins. Why don't you just go to the post office? So anyways, we used to have blue boxes that we knew were not recycling bins. Let's take a look at this. What we did, next slide, is if you want to go, yeah, there you go. we got these people to give us every card they received or a photocopy of it, and we assessed like how much they care about these cards, how much they feel connected, who gave them the cards, and then we asked how close they feel to these people. So, and what they send. And I'm really interested in the never close people. And what you can see here is that particularly in midlife, people are sending cards to people they were never close to. And those are probably some business connections, some colleagues and so on. But by late life, midlife and late life, they're getting cards from people they never felt close to. Let's go to the next slide. When we asked them about the meaning of those cards, now not surprisingly, it is a little bit surprising here that there's pretty much a consistent response of the emotional and sentimental feeling to it. The link to one's personal past is slightly higher for the older adults. It's significantly higher. And what's interesting there is it's like your college roommate. And somebody wrote to us afterwards and told us that they were still getting cards from their husband's college roommate, George or something. And they finally had to write to George and say, look, Sam died 3 years ago. But it still meant something to George to write this card to part of his personal past or to receive one. Let's go to the next slide. What was interesting is that social embeddedness, which is kind of a feeling of belongingness, it's also the opposite, if you will, of social isolation. Rather than feeling socially isolated or lonely, it's kind of a scale that's the happy end of that. And social embeddedness was predicted by more cards and more cards from weak ties, particularly for older adults. And if we go to the next slide, the next slide will be my next study. But the basic finding there sets something up for me to look at, which is how do these weak ties contribute to people's lives in ways that enrich it? And what more could these weak ties be doing? So we just completed the daily experiences and well-being study of adults over age 65. It was a really intensive study. I could give you a whole lecture on what it's like to try to do this kind of research because we did a 2-hour initial interview and that went really well. And we had, we did some little blood pressure assessments and some dynamometer where they do the grip strength. And we did all of that good stuff and that went fine. And we had it in Spanish, we had it in English. We had bilingual interviewers and that all went great. And then we had them do this data intensive for about 6 days where they wore an Actical. It was a wrist-mounted Actical. They answered ecological momentary assessments. I'll tell you a little more about that in a minute. We did recordings of their sound, and I'll show you that. And I won't have time to show you today, but we actually photographed their living space, and we coded that, and I'm presenting that at GSA. So if you have a burning desire to know about that one, you can live stream or something like that. But I'm not going to get to that. But we did a lot of data collection. And the one part I will say is that if you think about it, maybe 3% of the time, maybe 10% of the time you have a glitch technologically. When you are doing something for 5 days with 4 different devices, it was constant. Usually I get in the field and after 2 weeks, things kind of settle down or whatever. The last day we collected data in this study, we were still solving different technical problems. So just forewarned. Let's go to the next slide. The sample was in reasonable health, but we had a nice distribution. We had a pretty educated sample, which is Austin, half of all older adults have a college degree, so it's pretty representative. We did have people with only high school degrees, 15 to 20%. We provided a lot of training in the use of the devices, and we provided a lot of phone support for that as well. And certainly, I think Gizem Huller had a really great paper in the American Psychologist about social ties and technology. And I think part of that gets at the idea that all older adults, a lot of older adults are pretty adept at this, but not all. And so a good chunk of it, we needed to do some training. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about social involvement. And we used a measure of actual social integration. And you'll see that with the little octagons I've got there. Hexagons I got there, whichever. You can see like my little purple and green shapes that have things like your spouse, your child, your sibling, your parent. And the Cohen social integration measure asks you about involvement in these roles in the past 2 weeks. Interesting is they don't ask you, you can ask how many children, and we do have that, but Cohen doesn't look at that. It's did you interact with any children? So having 1 grown child versus 9 is as much of a score on a social integration measure, because it's about the role. Are you a parent and are you feeling that role? So it's kind of an interesting assessment. We also did Tony Antonucci's convoy measure, the 3 circles. It's very widely used. That's you in the middle. The inner circle are the people you can't imagine life without. The middle circle is people who are not that close, but are still important. And the outer circle are the people you haven't already mentioned, but who are important to you. Please don't mention people you happen to know or be related to. We'd like to know the people who are important in your life. So that's the measure. And so we have this measure purely of close ties, and we have a lot of information on those ties. Relationship qualities, age, gender, how long you've known them, just all the kind of stuff, support, all that stuff we have on the close ties. I'm not going to talk so much about the close ties, except to show you that we could sort of subtract them or look at them as part of our integration measure. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, we had a bunch of outcome measures. I won't spend a lot of time on that. I just want you to know that there's a lot of good stuff in the DEWS study. And if we go to the next slide. Okay, this is what I want to talk about for the next 10-15 minutes, which is the weak ties in everyday life and how we looked at that. So if you go to the next slide, what happened is that we knew who was in the convoy model, right? So we transferred that from the global interview to a handheld device. And that allowed us to ask every 3 hours, did you see these people? And then we could ask for up to 6 additional types of persons. We do know the mode of contact. We know if it's in phone, in person, and so on. We know if it was in a group or alone. I'm not going to talk so much about that, but I just want to let you know in case you're thinking like, what, wouldn't it matter if it was phone or in person? We do look at that. We have the electronic as well, but it's actually not that high a rate of electronic contact in this group, despite their education. So we could do that, and we can look at those 6 additional people every 3 hours. So throughout the day, we have 6 assessments. So that would potentially be 36 weak contact ties. Let's go to the next one. We also, at each of those momentary assessments, we asked about behaviors and we asked about mood. And so I'm going to talk about behaviors, but I want to give a shout out to Sumi Lee because we drew on some of her really great work on activity diversity. And in fact, she met with my grad student and I this morning, and my grad student remembered that we used her calculations for this. So I probably don't have to go into too much detail there. You can read Sumi's work on that too. We'll go to the next slide. The other thing I'm going to talk about is this ActiCal and then the electronically activated recorder, which captures conversation. It captures sound in the environment 30 seconds out of every 7 minutes. And most states now are single party consent. So long as your participant consents, you can record. It doesn't matter. We try to make it obvious, and we don't code anybody else's speech because it just doesn't feel right to us. But just so you know, you can do that with no problem. And there are hundreds of studies now that have done it, but not so much in old age. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, I should have updated that. This paper came out in 2019. My apology. I don't know why I listed it as in press, but we predicted that these encounters with weak ties would lead to more diverse behaviors and higher physical activity and less sedentary time. And the reason for that is that you can just sit around with your close social partners. You can just sit around with them and maybe you just watch some TV or whatever. In order to interact with someone who's not close, they don't live in your house, because if they lived in your house, they'd be more than that. You have to at least get out of your chair. Sedentary is one of the big killers right now. So you at least have to get up and answer the door. And usually it's much more than that. So let's go to the next slide. Just so you know, at every 3-hour assessment, there's a lot of contact with close ties. About half the time people have seen at least 1 weak tie. The number of diverse behaviors out of those 14 was 3.63. And the percent of time being sedentary was about half the time, which is actually low, believe it or not. Americans are pretty sedentary. Of course, this was pre-COVID when everybody wasn't just sitting on Zoom all the time, but older adults, so this is an older population. Physical activity counts, the reason I'm not giving you an average is they're measured in APOCs, and just through this, they kind of are meaningless if they just seem kind of meaningless because they're big numbers and whatever. I'll try to show you more about them in a graphic format. But the bottom line is that what we want to know is within person, those changes in activity. And this is a very finely calibrated. This is way more calibrated than a Fitbit. This can tell, like Fitbit, you might be able to get away with this, thinking it's activity. And this device is much more sensitive than that, so you can't fake it out. Next slide. Okay, so what we found, we were interested in this idea of the diversity of behaviors, the close ties and the weak ties. And what we found is that diversity of behaviors is predicted by both close ties and weak ties. So interestingly, when you are with your close ties, you're more likely to be active in a variety of ways, perhaps than when you're alone. And maybe that makes sense. But weak ties predict physical activity in ways that close ties don't. One of the things I'll tell you is there are publications that I have or papers ready to go that I can send you. I just recently have found that on Zoom, I have a really hard time following models and things, so I didn't put them in here. Well, you guys are on Teams, but same idea. Let's go forward one slide. Okay. One of the things that we were interested in, though, is lagged effects. So maybe more diverse social encounters predicts having more activity. And maybe that activity gets you to the more diverse social encounters. So it could be that we're in a cycle, that there's some people who are just active and socially active, and that it's not really a predictive model, it's a co-occurrence model. So if we go to the next slide, this one still might confuse you a little, but I thought it might be better than a model. So if you take a look at the top, this is the degree of social integration. How many diverse kinds of social partners have you engaged with in the past 3 hours? And what you can see is that actually increases in the afternoon, perhaps not surprisingly. If you looked at the diversity of behaviors, that also increases and is particularly high sort of late afternoon into the early evening. That's your green line. And then if you look at your, the little circles below those graphs, that's the percentage of time sedentary. And again, what you're seeing, this is our average participant, by the way. We just chose an average participant. The little blue line is their actual activity rate. And what is interesting there is that it is both lagged and concurrent. And what you can see is that this activity peaked around 1 p.m., 1300 hours. That does co-occur with the social integration. But the social integration continues until 4 p.m. You have very little sedentary, but your activity level is not all that high. And in fact, it's not much higher on average than at the other time periods. And one thing that we wondered about and haven't delved into is that maybe, you're 75, 80, 85, 90 years old, you get together with these people, you walk to the cafe, you sit down, and now you're having coffee. And, there's only so much you're going to do. You're not going to go running a marathon with them. Some people will, but our average participant isn't. So there is some co-occurrence of this, and it's not necessarily a causal model. It could be a co-occurrence, and to me that makes sense. I said it earlier, you're going to see these people, you got to get out of the house, you got to walk to the cafe, maybe you walk around a museum. One didn't really cause the other, they co-occur. Let's go to the next slide. For mood, it was the close ties. The close ties, being with your close ties puts more positive mood. Now, interestingly, our research, a lot of research shows that close ties can also predict negative things. The one thing here, the weak ties had no association. Some of our prior work has shown that in younger people, your close ties are more ambivalent. You feel both close and irritated. And your weak ties are more likely to be a pure negative if we just looked at the pure negatives. And that's things like that coworker who drives you nuts. It's something like that. But on this daily basis, in late life, we were not getting the effect for mood with the weak ties. Let's look for a minute at a summary of where we are. Next slide. Okay, so here's what we know so far. Encounters with weak ties get you more diverse behaviors, more physical activity, and fewer sedentary periods. This is important because of all those models of social integration and all that research I showed you, most of it had focused on emotion. There's been very little research, and one of the interesting things is that, aside from how much your relationships and social integration may mitigate stress, may provide you with resources, The fact that they get you up and moving is probably contributing to the fact that you're going to live longer. The interacting with close ties also was associated with more diversity of behaviors and more positive emotions, but not less negative. And sorry, that is a typo. The physical activity is accounted for by the weak ties. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is a really cool visualization of our electronically activated recorder data. Again, we just took an average participant. This goes from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., half the day. And the brown is when they were watching television. And the rainbow is when they were actively engaged in conversation. So what you can see is that there's a lot of silence in people's lives. And also that if you think of these as cognitive stimulation and cognitive risk, that those things are occurring throughout the day in different patterns. I'm not going to talk specifically about cognitive parts of it, but I'm going to talk about social parts of it. If we could go to the next slide. What we did is 80% of our files had sound. The reason we have that, we colored it up. It made it look really cool. But we actually used just Adobe Audition to look at where the sounds were silent, and we didn't code those. We double transcribed them, and we've so far been looking with the linguistic inquiry and word count. I just want to take a quick look at the next slide. Will show you social contact and conversation. So when we did these analyses, we looked at that 3-hour contact with close and weak ties. And for both, just being with someone, maybe not surprisingly, you're going to have more conversation than when you're alone. But this was more so for close ties than weak ties. So although all of it compared to alone is more conversation, you talk more with your close ties. I should give a caveat. My grad student is just submitted a paper on showing that most of that conversation with close ties is married older adults talking with a spouse. No surprise there. So there's just a caveat there. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, I'm sorry, that's a duplicate. Let's go to the one after that. Oops, we're back one. I guess I have a duplicate that you don't. Yeah, the model, if you could click, thank you. Okay, no, one more, sorry, there, okay. So daily contact with close ties, interestingly, also is associated with more TV watching. Older adults, their screen of choice is still the television. They're watching 6 to 7 hours a day of television. Television is almost always a sedentary activity. It's almost synonymous with being sedentary. So this is another finding that replicates what I've already shown you regarding physical activity, but it's also a mechanism that may be contributing to it. And so if you're just sitting around watching TV, you may have found some kind of a substitute way to entertain yourself, if you will, not be bored, which if you had a lot more weak ties, you might be able to, you might not be doing that as much. And at least in our data, those two things co-occur. So now we could go to the summary. Next slide. Okay, so both close and weak ties involve conversation, but there is more conversation with close partners. But there's also more television watching. So close partners represent a mixed bag, and weak ties are a source of conversation and may even be more so for older adults who do not have a spouse. And we've, again, we just put a paper in under review that showed that. So friends and acquaintances for widowed older adults are a big source of conversation, more so than their grown children, which is kind of interesting. So again, it's sort of that getting out of the family ties. There's a lot of action there that, that we haven't fully considered in the literature. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so we did a follow-up study during COVID-19 looking at what if you live alone in and what's going on with that. And actually this paper just went into press last night. So if you want more information about it, I can even send it to you. Next slide. Okay, this one, we just did a survey. We had no devices because I mentioned there's a lot of training that goes into helping people use these devices and a lot of everyday support that, you know, once a day you call and say, did you recharge the battery? Do you need any help? As an aside, when we tried to use Apple devices, we used Android. But with our over 90 uneducated pilot study, I should say high school or below, we never once got both the box and the cord back because it just made no sense to them that those were separatable. So anyways, we didn't even try during COVID to do that. We did a survey. They could do it on the phone. We put together a web one because there are older adults who are very adept at that. And we also put together a paper and pencil one. It was all contactless though. So we got 226 of our participants back during the pandemic when we couldn't even go into the office. So we were pleased with that. We asked them about the prior 24 hours because we wanted to parallel at least what we had before. We couldn't do every 3 hours. We asked them about the morning, which we defined as waking till noon, the afternoon, which was noon to 5, and then the evening, 5 p.m. to bed. And it's kind of a modified day reconstruction method, which is widely used. And there's been enough research to show that people can do that validly, reporting the next day on what happened the day before. So if you could click there, there's a little bit of animation. Yeah, so we just analyzed the afternoon. What we did is we analyzed all 3 times a day. They came up very similarly. The pattern was almost identical using the data on what we're looking at. But most of the action, as you saw in the prior study, occurs afternoon to 5 p.m. So that's what I want to present to you. If we could go to the next slide. Well, interestingly, this was done, I should say, in May and June. And 83% of our sample was still sheltering in place. It was, and most of them, only 5% of them had any exposure in their family or so forth to COVID at that point. We looked at the effects of in-person contact. So you live alone, you are alone, and you get to see someone in person, socially distanced, and so on. For the older adults who live alone, that increased their positive mood. That is the lighter yellow, and I'm not sure what happened to our, oh yeah, there it is. Okay, the lighter yellow is the in-person for the live alone. It made a big difference for them. Their mood increased dramatically once they saw someone. The next slide was talking in by phone, and this is a little bit not what we want to see as gerontologists, because we would like to think that we could substitute technologically, and particularly with the phone, which older adults, it's a very old technology. These people grew up using the phone, they know how to do it. And what we found was that for the people living alone, there was an increase in negative emotion, and actually when we unpacked it, it was the loneliness. After they talk on the phone, their loneliness increases. And you know, there's a lot of hypotheses about that. I should tell you, other studies have found that. We have found something like that in other studies as well, though obviously this needs to be replicated with regard to COVID. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, in-person social contacts. Well, for the people who lived with others, it was almost always their spouse. Almost everyone who lives with someone lives with a spouse, and almost everyone who has a spouse lives with them, so that's not at all surprising. The grown children, there's no difference. Friends, there is a difference. So if they saw someone in person, the people who lived alone saw a friend, a neighbor, a service provider, or someone else, you know, a member of my church came by. And what's interesting there, again, is that for these live alone people, the people that are giving them that boost are not family, and not because they don't love their family, but because they're seeing other people. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is that just gave us the boxes. Okay, phone contact. Nobody talks to their spouse on the phone because it's COVID-19 and you can just scream down the hall. But again, the phone contact is with the friends again, and there's something about that that's making them feel more separated, perhaps because it's just so much harder to see them, and so a lot of them. So that was, but I think that's just important to look at those roles, at those social partners again, beyond just did you have contact. Let's go to the next slide for a little summary. Okay. I didn't show you this, but if you live alone, interestingly, they didn't report more loneliness, and you might have seen that in the graph a little bit, but they did report less contentment. The boost in positive emotion occurred in both gratitude and contentment with in-person contact. And gratitude is a really interesting area of research, and something that I sent a weekly email to my class about what we're doing that week, because it gets really confusing for students with all the different platforms and whatever. So like, here's what you have in my course. And I always give like a little, I don't know what you call it, but like a side note where one week I was like, okay, before you get started, write down 3 things you're grateful for. And they always do these things. So I get these emails, I wrote down 9, it made me so much happier. So gratitude, that boost for in-person was for both of those, which was really kind of nice for us. Let's go to the next slide and talk about future directions. We didn't include, all close and weak ties, and I do wonder if there's a greater variety. The weak ties, there are studies. Be nice to dig a little deeper and look a little broader. I told you that my grad student has been analyzing marital status, and I've been looking at living, whether you live alone. We have photographs of the living rooms, and we can look deeper at the COVID implications because we also know if they've moved since we took those photographs in 2016. And if they haven't, we know where they're spending the most time right now. So we could look at some of those effects of living space. Certainly macro environment and neighborhoods have become increasingly important in our field. And so it might be interesting to look at some of the micro environments too. If we could go to the next slide. Okay, so my take home messages. The weak ties get you out in the world. Next, close ties help you feel better at home. And the next, but we all get by with a little help from our friends and consequential strangers. So there's a good message there. I think we could also talk about the role of consequential strangers and weak ties right now during COVID, because it's a very different configuration right now. And we see that with the people living alone, but it's continued a lot longer than we did that study. If we could go to the next slide. I do need to say that this was truly a team effort. I had funding available. I had support from the Texas Aging and Longevity Center and the Population Research Center at UT Austin. And, so really, I am very grateful to all the other people who did a lot of the work on this. And the next slide. So I'll wrap up there and leave a little time for questions.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So folks, feel free to type some questions and comments into the live Q&A. I will be repeating those. And while we're waiting for those, Karen, I'm going to go ahead and take the prerogative of asking you the first question. So have you done any work on whether people may have ties that they communicate with through social media, including, some of the weaker ties? I know that for myself, as a baseball fan, I've been closely communicating with fellow Tampa Bay Rays fans on Twitter, and it's very lively and really fun in a way I've gotten to know a lot of people. So have you done any of that work, or is that in the works for you?
That is a little bit in the works, and I think, like I mentioned, Gisem Huller has written a little bit about that, and we also have a chapter with the National Academy of Sciences looking at that, and the research literature isn't well enough established yet. There are the people, like I do the same thing. I mean, I'm on Twitter, and I don't know, I'm following these sociologists. I don't even know how I ended up with them, but they're hilarious. They post these really funny, academic relating things where, like the other day, I actually did this. I crunched some rice cakes into my students' ears without realizing I was still on mic. So there's just, crazier things than that. And I really like it, but I think there's been some limit on the percentage of people and how you would differentiate the social media. What we're looking at is sort of constellations of people. And so how do you differentiate that from some of the other, like I have all these great colleagues that I also interact with this way. And then locally, I live in a really nice neighborhood with lots of trees, and I can walk and see people too. So how do we know, I think that's going to be in the future. And I think particularly with the younger people, I think as our cohort and younger than us ages, we'll be able to disentangle that a little bit better, because so much more of it is occurring. And certainly I noticed that with my kids who are teenagers, that they don't actually miss the in-person. They're doing everything. They have Zoom lunch, they have Netflix party, they have, I don't know, party room or something. Anyways, they have a whole social world that is completely satisfying for them. And it's not like they're going to stop doing that when they get older, but the current cohort is a little harder to study that because it's class related.
Great, thanks so much. I'm not getting other questions coming in at this point. I hope other students and faculty will type in some questions to the live Q&A, but I'll ask you another one since I've got plenty of things to ask. So can your pets be part of your strong and weak ties? And
Oh, that is such a great question. When I said people don't talk as much alone,
yeah,
we did get people talking to their pets, and it's hilarious because one of the first ones is like this guy who says, hey Joe, I think you should watch the Cubs with me tonight. I watched the Mets with you last night, and I think it's only fair. And he keeps talking to this guy named Joe until day 2 when he says, "Good boy, Joe. Arf, 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 arf. Good boy." And you're like, oh my God, Joe is a dog. This man lives alone. We code without knowing their context. But once we put the context together, oh, he lives alone, and Joe is the guy he talks to, and we have all kinds of stuff that goes on like that. And interestingly, I don't think we have enough data on it, but we had one man who the transcriber said he prays to his wife every morning. In the morning, he would wake up and say, Catherine, I'm going to have a day where I go to the store and I'm going to go shop and I'm going to buy all those things that you used to, and he would talk to her about the day he had coming. And he was widowed. And so there's some really interesting things that you get from conversation. And we also did code the rooms for pets. So I really wish we'd asked more about it. We asked in the COVID study, and what we found just is that, interestingly, it's actually the people who live with other people who are more likely to have a pet. We thought they'd be compensating, but at least the data we got from the COVID study, no, the pets are with people who have a spouse or a grown kid or someone they live with. So yeah, I love it. I'm going to try to write a paper on that, maybe this winter, but we don't, I have I was funded, so I have an obligation to NIH to address some of the things I said I would address. And I didn't have in the grant, I wonder if anyone talks to a pet named Joe. So it's kind of an aside interest that I want to get, but I love that question.
So we've got 2 other great questions here. One is, were there any different patterns across different racial or ethnic groups?
It's a really great question. We did have a quarter of the sample is Hispanic, and they're in Austin. That's almost all Mexican American. It's like 98% Mexican American of our Hispanic population, and then African American is 25%. And I don't fully know the answer to that yet, and I need to look at it in more depth. We didn't get as good a turnout in the COVID study of our ethnic and racial minorities groups, so it's not going to be possible there. But we do need to do more work with our different groups. It's a great question. And, we also would welcome, if you want to collaborate, I was just talking to Sumi Lee. She's working with Susan Charles with some of our data. So, you're always welcome to just contact me and we can find a way for you to work with us.
That's a very generous offer. I got another great question for you here. Have you looked at how personality affects the effects of strong and weak ties? Are introverts differently affected than extroverts by limited ties? Or might weak ties be less or more important?
It's a really good question. We have been looking at personality. We've been particularly looking at personality in the rooms that people's living space expresses different personality. We looked at personality in activities, like is it the case that more extroverted people go out and see other people more during the day? And the answer to that is yes. Now, what you're asking, theoretically, I think that the types of interactions with weak ties would certainly be different. So I'm pretty extroverted. Like I said, I know everybody. I know my pharmacist. Before we had COVID, I used to bake cookies and bring them over to the pharmacist and whatever. So I am pretty extroverted. But that doesn't mean that an introvert doesn't derive meaning and a sense of grounding by seeing that same pharmacist. And in fact, you might think it's even greater because the introvert having to deal with completely new faces and new social stimuli, it might be even harder. And so that familiarity, but it might not be that they have a conversation. It might not be that they bring each other cookies. It might just be that visual and familiar interaction has meaning. And I would really like to see that in more depth than we even have in DEWS for looking at it.
So I've got a bunch more questions coming in, but I know we have to stop in a few minutes. So let me give you 1 or 2 of them at least. How do you intervene for those who only interact with their core ties? Do you increase their weak ties? Do you modify the underlying mechanisms of the weak ties well-being relationship? Which is more feasible?
Oh, that's such a great question. The intervention element to this is really challenging. And, part of it that you have included, but I bet you're thinking about is also that as disability onset comes, when this might make more of a difference, you might need your close ties to mediate this, and your close ties may or may not want to get you out with other people, depending how controlling they are, depending on their value for family, depending on how easy it is to get you out. So there's a lot there that we have to consider. I think the COVID situation gives us some interesting avenues to consider that, particularly for in-person stimulation, where in the past it's been incumbent on the older adults sort of to get out of the house and go to the senior center or go somewhere. Now we need to rethink that, and maybe it's, you know, that we need to have more consequential strangers visiting older adults. And anecdotally I've heard about that in New York City, that people would just go out on their balconies and sing with their neighbors and things. And so if we could use some of what we're learning right now, and if we could learn it quicker about connecting people, not just by technology, but in person, not making it on the older adult to have to leave the house, I think that we could develop better interventions.
So I got a whole bunch of questions here, but I'll just give you one more because I know your meeting with the students is coming up. So here's one more to close it out. Do you have any thoughts about interactive video streaming? It seemed that some individuals connect with online personalities, and there's an interesting internet fad called mukbangs, that's new to me, in which people eat in front of their camera and those watching can eat with them.
That's a really, really interesting idea. I know that my temple they had senior lunches, and I know that, I think it was Neil Charnas's aging center that put together also how to use Zoom for people even with mild cognitive impairments. They have like these instructions for older adults to really get that accessible. I'll give a little shout out to 2 sophomores here in the College of Engineering who put together this program called Big and Mini for older adults. They'll do it by phone, they'll do it however you want, but the goal of it is to take young adults and let them be mentored by older adults, which makes it much more appealing. So, you know, I'm a young adult going through COVID. I want to just talk to you and see what advice you have for me to cope with this. And I want to share my hobbies and your hobbies. And it's been astonishingly successful very quickly. So they do a lot of it by video streaming for those who are comfortable, but they also have been seeking other ways for the connection. And so I think that, yeah, I think the eating is great. I think the mutual mentoring, sharing hobbies is great. I think that making older adults feel needy is not always the best way to get them to connect to. This goes to the intervention question too, that it's much more appealing to an older adult to feel like they're empowered, or at least a partner.
Great. So we've had even more questions come in, but we're going to have to stop for now so that Karen and the students can get set for pro-seminar. And I also, one part of a usual presentation we can't do is the group applause, but I will applaud you myself.
Thank you. Thank you. I really
did a wonderful job, Karen. Thanks for coming.
Oh my God. Thank you, Bill, so much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to meet so many of you. It's a really nice opportunity during this pandemic. So thank you so much.
Great. And for any of you who didn't get to ask your questions, I know that Karen would be receptive to an email or asking that question at a later time today.
Yeah, so, absolutely. Absolutely. And the fact that I didn't have to travel there means that I can set up a time to talk with you by phone or Zoom or whatever. So feel free to contact me.
Great. Well, we will end the session and I will look forward to seeing you later.
Okay. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.